What's up, my Yu-Gi Bros? I'm your host, the one, the only, the RJB0. Welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! In Business Casual. So, outs are a natural part of Yu-Gi-Oh! Part of the playing of the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the interaction between a player and their opponent, and a good portion of that interaction comes from one of the two players having an out for the play of the other player. The way that the game is supposed to go is one player attempts to make a play, and the other player attempts to use their outs to hit the most critical part of that play in order to stop that play. And if you hit the critical part, then good. You get to survive to your next turn. If you don't hit the critical part, or if your opponent has an out to your out, then, well, that's how it goes. But lately, that sort of one-for-one responsive interaction has not been possible, primarily because of the degree to which decks can survive getting hit on their critical play. Decks these days are so effective at putting down multiple plays that they can run into a one-off out and still continue with their turn. And that's where we run into Floodgate cards. Floodgate cards are an unofficial card type, which are basically cards which don't allow either player to do something. Whether it's special summoning, activating certain effects, or attacking, Floodgate cards put a blanket block on one type of play. The major problem with Floodgate cards is they limit the interaction in a game. While one player has a Floodgate card, the other player basically cannot play. Floodgate cards which block both players are usually activated after one player has done all of the plays they need to and are just holding on to the board they already have. For instance, establishing multiple El Shaddai monsters on the board and then flipping Vanity's Emptiness during your opponent's turn. You no longer need to do any special summoning, so the block on special summoning that Vanity's Emptiness puts on you doesn't actually hurt you. This kind of mechanic completely destroys player interaction and can lock a player out of the entire game unless they draw into an out like MST. But in today's game state, some kind of card that stops your opponent from going off for a turn is necessary to the game. So the question becomes, how do you solve a problem like a Floodgate? Now, there are three different ways that I can think of that can plausibly solve the Floodgate problem. If there were Floodgate-like cards that were normal spells and traps, so you activated them and then for just that turn they had their effects, and that could plausibly solve the problem of locking a player out of a game unless they draw into an out. But there is one issue with a mechanic like that, and anybody who has played during the Cold Wave formats will know that a card like that has no drawback for the player using it. A card which only operates for one turn does not stop you from making your plays during your turn. The reason why it's arguable that cards like Macrocosmos and D-Fissure are somewhat balanced is because they do the same thing to you that they do to your opponent. But a card that only acts as Vanity's Emptiness for one turn has zero drawback for you, and therefore is probably very unhealthy for the game. The logical progression from realizing that a card that only works for one turn is really bad for the game is to think about a card that has a long-term time limit. Say a card like Swords of Revealing Light, which after a couple of turns will destroy itself. As opposed to a card which wears off after a turn and doesn't have a drawback to you, a card which wears off after multiple turns also blocks you out of that mechanic for that amount of time. The problem with a long-term time limit on a Floodgate card is that a long-term time limit essentially acts as no time limit in a format like this, where play moves so quickly that you can lose in just a couple of turns. So a time-limited Floodgate card may not have the kind of problem-solving effect that we want it to have. The final possible solution to the Floodgate debate is a type of card that we actually are already familiar with in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now because of Vanity's Emptiness. And those are Floodgate cards which, given a certain game state, destroy themselves. It seems Konami is actually already experimenting with this, given the effect of Reclifort, which says that if it is the only Cliffort card that you control, it will destroy itself. Cards with a self-destruction clause give your opponent an alternate out besides the traditional ones like MST Twister and Dust Tornado. I personally think that this is the best solution, since a card with an alternate destruction clause will force a player to play the suboptimal turn in order to play around that, but it doesn't block them out potentially from the entire game. For instance, a card like Reclifort. board, if you start your play and your opponent has a Reclifort face down and they flip it up and they've got a Cliffort monster on the board, instead of making your normal play, you now have to get rid of that Cliffort monster. But it doesn't mean that necessarily, if you don't have the MST available, you won't be able to play until you draw into that MST. Instead, you just divert your play for a turn to try and play around the Reclifort. This way, it slows down big plays for a turn without the potential to lock an opponent entirely out of the game. Now, Konami has yet to create a really strong self-destruct clause, a clause which doesn't prevent the card from being usable, but also doesn't make it too hard to get around it potentially. If Konami were to make more cards like this with moderately easy self-destruction clauses, then I think that we could have the perfect balance between the Floodgate cards and the kind of player interaction that this game is really good at. So what do you think? Are Floodgates good for the game as they are? What solution would you give to try and make Floodgates more balanced? Meanwhile, thank you guys for watching. I'm your host, the one, the only, the RJB0, and I got a jet. See you guys.